Some people think cruelty disappears the moment the room grows quiet, but the truth is, silence often remembers everything. Naomi Carter kept her eyes lowered as she balanced the polished silver tray with both hands, careful not to let the porcelain cups rattle against their matching saucers while the Romano family's annual spring gathering unfolded beneath glittering crystal chandeliers. The estate looked more like a European palace than a private home, with marble floors reflecting warm golden light, towering windows overlooking perfectly trimmed gardens, and a dining room large enough to host nearly 50 guests. Every conversation carried the effortless confidence of people who had never worried about missing a meal, never counted dollars before buying groceries, never wondered how to stretch a paycheck until Friday. Naomi moved quietly among them in her neatly pressed black uniform, almost invisible despite being only a few feet away from the laughter echoing around the table. She preferred it that way. Invisible people finished their shifts. Invisible people paid rent. Invisible people could keep sending money every month to the mother waiting for another medical appointment back in Baltimore. She had worked 3 jobs before earning this position, and even now she reminded herself that dignity wasn't measured by titles but by endurance. The silver teapot felt heavier with every careful step as she approached the head table where Victoria Romano sat surrounded by expensive jewelry, designer fabrics, and the effortless arrogance that seemed to fill every inch of the room before she even spoke. Victoria accepted admiration as naturally as breathing, smiling politely for relatives while quietly correcting servers over the smallest imperfections. Naomi had already witnessed 2 employees reduced to tears during the afternoon, each walking away with nothing more than a whispered apology while pretending everything was fine. She hoped only to finish pouring the tea without becoming the next target. Outside, the distant hum of a luxury engine rolled through the front gates, unnoticed beneath the music drifting from hidden speakers across the mansion. Naomi reached Victoria's place setting, lifted the elegant white teapot, and began pouring steaming Earl Grey into the delicate china cup with steady hands. Then a guest called Victoria's name from across the table. Victoria turned abruptly, her sleeve brushing against the edge of the teapot. A splash of hot tea spilled across the tablecloth before splattering onto Naomi's wrist and the front of her uniform. The sudden heat made her inhale sharply, but she refused to cry out. She immediately lowered the teapot and reached for a folded linen napkin. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, believing the accident would end there. Instead, the room grew strangely still. Victoria slowly looked down at the scattered drops on the imported tablecloth before lifting her eyes toward Naomi with an expression colder than the untouched ice floating inside nearby crystal glasses. Around them, conversations faded one by one as curious faces turned toward the scene. Naomi felt every stare settling on her shoulders, while her heartbeat echoed louder than the soft music filling the room. Beyond the tall windows, a sleek black Rolls-Royce eased to a stop beneath the mansion's grand entrance. The driver stepped out first. Then the rear door opened, and somewhere inside the estate, without a single guest realizing it yet, Vincent Romano had just come home. Naomi quickly pressed the linen napkin against her wrist before anyone could notice the redness spreading across her dark skin. The warmth stung, but years of difficult jobs had taught her that pain passed more quickly than public embarrassment. She lowered her eyes and quietly began blotting the tea from the pristine white tablecloth, hoping humility would end the uncomfortable silence. Instead, Victoria Romano slowly pushed back her chair, the soft scrape against the marble floor sounding far louder than it should have. She looked down at Naomi with the practiced smile of someone who enjoyed reminding others exactly where they belonged. "Do you understand how much this table setting costs?" she asked, her voice perfectly calm, which somehow made every word feel sharper. Naomi nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am. I am very sorry. It was an accident." Victoria folded her arms. "An accident that happened because you were careless." Naomi wanted to explain that the unexpected movement had caused the spill, but she stopped herself. Excuses rarely changed minds already determined to judge. Around the table, several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances before returning to their glasses of wine, pretending intense interest in conversations that had suddenly become impossible to hear. Others watched openly, curiosity replacing sympathy. Naomi could almost feel herself shrinking beneath their attention. She remembered her mother's words from years earlier, spoken after another customer had unfairly blamed her during a cleaning job. Never let someone else's pride become your character. She repeated those words silently now while keeping her breathing steady. Victoria took one slow step closer. People like you always say you are sorry, she continued. But saying sorry never repairs expensive things. Naomi gently lifted the stained napkin from the table. I will personally pay for any damage, even if I need to work extra hours. A faint laugh escaped from one of the guests seated farther down the table. Another quietly whispered something that caused two others to smile behind their glasses. None of them knew that Naomi had been sending nearly every paycheck home for over 2 years, helping cover prescriptions, physical therapy appointments, and utility bills that her mother could no longer manage alone. To them, she was simply another employee in a black uniform standing beneath glittering chandeliers. Victoria looked almost amused by Naomi's offer. Pay for it? She repeated. Do you know how many months you would have to work before you could replace even one place setting? Naomi remained silent. Pride urged her to defend herself, but responsibility reminded her why she could not afford to lose this job. She quietly bent down to collect the small porcelain spoon that had slipped onto the floor during the confusion. As she reached for it, she noticed a little girl sitting near the end of the table watching everything with wide, uncertain eyes. Unlike the adults, the child was not smiling. She simply looked confused, as though she could not understand why kindness had disappeared from such a beautiful room. Naomi offered the little girl a gentle, reassuring smile before standing again. At that same moment, the mansion's massive front doors opened somewhere beyond the dining hall. Heavy footsteps echoed through the polished corridors with calm, measured confidence. The conversations that had slowly begun returning suddenly faded once more, because everyone recognized the unmistakable rhythm of the man whose presence alone could change the atmosphere of the entire estate before he spoke a single word. The echo of polished dress shoes traveled steadily across the marble hallway, but the guests inside the dining room had not yet seen the man approaching. They only heard the quiet rhythm that seemed to silence every unnecessary conversation. Naomi remained standing beside the table with the folded linen napkin resting gently against her wrist, hoping the moment would pass before anyone else noticed the growing tension. Instead, Victoria lifted the porcelain teacup from the table and slowly examined the faint stain left across its matching saucer. Her expression hardened with every passing second. This is exactly why standards matter, she said, loud enough for nearly everyone in the room to hear. A beautiful home deserves employees who understand elegance. Naomi lowered her head. I understand, ma'am. I will clean everything immediately. Victoria looked around the table as though inviting approval from the family members surrounding her. Several offered polite smiles while others avoided eye contact altogether. No one challenged her words. Naomi carefully reached for another clean napkin, determined to remove every trace of the spill before the gathering continued. She had nearly finished wiping the table when Victoria abruptly stepped closer and tipped the remaining warm tea from her cup toward the edge of the linen, allowing it to splash across the cloth and onto Naomi's already stained sleeve. The liquid was no longer as hot as before, but it spread quickly, soaking the black fabric and leaving fresh marks across the carefully pressed uniform she had ironed before sunrise. A quiet gasp escaped from somewhere near the end of the table. Naomi froze for only a heartbeat before instinct took over. She immediately began blotting the new spill with another napkin. I am sorry, she whispered again, even though she knew she had done nothing wrong. Victoria gave a satisfied smile. Perhaps now you will remember to be more careful. The words settled over the room like heavy dust. Naomi could feel dozens of eyes studying her reaction, almost waiting for tears or anger. Instead, she simply continued cleaning with slow, careful movements that reflected neither resentment nor humiliation. Years earlier, her mother had taught her that another person's cruelty should never become permission to lose your own character. Naomi clung to that lesson now more tightly than ever. As she knelt to gather another fallen spoon, she noticed the same little girl watching from the far end of the table. The child quietly slid her own folded napkin across the table toward Naomi without saying a word. It was a tiny gesture, almost invisible among the expensive centerpieces and polished silver, yet it carried more kindness than the entire room had shown all afternoon. Naomi accepted it with a grateful smile that reached her tired eyes. Before either of them could speak, the towering double doors to the dining hall opened completely. Every conversation stopped. Every chair seemed to grow still. Vincent Romano stepped inside wearing a charcoal suit that contrasted sharply with the warm light spilling from the crystal chandeliers overhead. His calm blue eyes moved across the room with quiet precision, taking in the overturned napkins, the stained tablecloth, the damp sleeve of Naomi's uniform, and the uneasy expressions that no one managed to hide quickly enough. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush forward. He simply paused in the doorway, and somehow that silence carried more authority than any shout ever could. For several long seconds, no one moved. Vincent Romano remained near the entrance with one hand resting lightly against the back of a vacant dining chair. His expression impossible to read beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. He did not demand explanations. He did not acknowledge the nervous greetings offered by distant relatives who suddenly remembered their manners. Instead, his attention settled quietly on Naomi. Her uniform sleeve was damp. The delicate skin around her wrist had turned noticeably red, and yet she was still carefully collecting scattered utensils as though restoring order mattered more than defending herself. That single detail lingered in his mind longer than anyone realized. Most people complained before they contributed. She was contributing before saying a single word. Victoria recovered first, wearing the polished smile she reserved for influential guests. "Vincent, you are home earlier than expected," she said warmly. "A tiny misunderstanding interrupted lunch, but everything is already under control." Vincent nodded once without looking away from Naomi. "Is it?" His voice was calm, almost conversational, yet every person seated around the table straightened instinctively. Victoria laughed softly. The maid became distracted and spilled tea everywhere. Fortunately, nothing important was damaged. Naomi lowered her eyes. She could have spoken then. She could have explained exactly what had happened. Instead, she quietly placed the final spoon back onto the serving tray and stepped backward. "The accident involved me, sir," she said gently. "I am sorry for interrupting the gathering." Several guests appeared relieved by her answer. It was easier when the quiet employee accepted the blame. Difficult conversations ended quickly that way. Vincent studied her face for another moment. The apology sounded sincere, but something about it felt incomplete. Experience had taught him that honest people often accepted responsibility even when others did not deserve their silence. Before he could ask another question, a small voice drifted across the room. "She is not telling the whole story." Every head turned toward the far end of the table. The little girl who had offered Naomi the folded napkin looked nervously at the adults surrounding her before lowering her gaze. Her mother immediately reached over as though hoping to stop whatever came next. "Emily," she whispered carefully, "this is not the time." The child hesitated, twisting the edge of her dress between her fingers. Naomi offered the girl the faintest shake of her head, silently asking her not to become involved. She refused to let a child carry the burden of an argument created by adults. Vincent noticed that silent exchange immediately. He crouched slightly until he was closer to Emily's eye level, his tone remaining patient. "You may speak if you wish. No one here will be punished for telling the truth." The dining room seemed to hold its breath. Emily looked first at Naomi, then at Victoria, and finally back at Vincent. "Miss Naomi did not make the first spill," she said quietly. "She kept saying she was sorry because she did not want anyone to fight." The words were simple, innocent, and completely free of calculation. They landed with unexpected weight inside the elegant dining room. Victoria's smile stiffened for the first time that afternoon. Around the table, relatives who had remained comfortably silent suddenly found themselves avoiding Vincent's eyes. Outside, sunlight filtered through the towering windows, casting long reflections across the marble floor, while inside the Romano mansion, The silence no longer belonged to embarrassment. It belonged to the truth that had finally begun to find its voice. Emily's quiet confession lingered in the air long after her small voice had faded. No one rushed to answer. Even the soft music drifting through the hidden speakers seemed distant beneath the weight of that simple truth. Vincent Romano slowly rose to his full height, his gaze moving calmly from one face to another around the enormous dining table. Years of leading powerful people had taught him that silence often revealed more than arguments ever could. Those who had witnessed the incident avoided his eyes. Those who knew nothing looked confused. Only Victoria continued holding her composed smile, although the confidence behind it had begun to crack. "Children misunderstand situations," she said with a light laugh that failed to soften the tension. Emily only saw part of what happened. Vincent turned toward the little girl. "Did anyone ask you to say those words?" Emily immediately shook her head. "No, sir." "Did Miss Naomi tell you what to say?" "No, sir. She asked me not to say anything." Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. That answer carried a quiet honesty impossible to rehearse. Vincent looked toward Naomi again. She remained standing with both hands folded respectfully in front of her, her damp sleeve still clinging to her arm. She had every opportunity to accuse someone, yet she had chosen silence instead. That decision interested him far more than the spilled tea itself. "Naomi," he said gently, "look at me." She hesitated before slowly raising her eyes. There was no resentment in them, only exhaustion and quiet dignity. "Tell me exactly what happened." Naomi took a careful breath. "Mrs. Victoria became upset after the tea spilled. I should have reacted more quickly. I am responsible for maintaining the dining room, and I regret that the gathering was interrupted." Vincent listened without interrupting. The words were polite, but they answered none of his questions. He noticed something else instead. Naomi continued protecting the very person who had embarrassed her. Not because she approved of what had happened, but because she feared creating division inside a family that employed her. That kind of restraint could not be purchased. Came only from character. An older voice finally spoke from the doorway. "Mr. Romano, if I may." Every head turned toward Margaret Ellis, the estate's senior housekeeper. She had worked for the Romano family for nearly 3 decades, earning respect through unwavering honesty rather than influence. Margaret stepped forward with measured confidence. "I witnessed the entire incident from the service entrance." Victoria's expression changed immediately. "Margaret, there is no need to involve yourself." The older woman respectfully ignored the interruption. "The first spill was accidental." Miss Naomi apologized immediately. She accepted responsibility before anyone asked her to. After that, additional tea was poured onto the table while Miss Naomi was attempting to clean the linen. No one spoke. Margaret continued in the same calm voice. Miss Naomi never complained. She only asked another employee to bring fresh napkins because she wished to protect the guests from further discomfort. The elegant dining room fell completely silent. Crystal glasses reflected the afternoon sunlight across the polished table, while every carefully maintained appearance began quietly collapsing beneath simple facts. Vincent lowered his eyes briefly toward the folded napkin still covering Naomi's reddened wrist before looking back at Victoria. His expression remained perfectly composed, but something unmistakable had changed. It was not anger. It was disappointment. And inside the Romano family, disappointment from Vincent carried far greater weight than raised voices ever could. No one dared interrupt the silence that followed. The magnificent dining room, designed to impress governors, executives, and diplomats, suddenly felt much smaller beneath the quiet weight of truth. Vincent Romano walked slowly toward the head of the table until he stood only a few feet from Victoria. His expression remained composed, but there was a clarity in his eyes that made even the most confident members of the family lower their gaze. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he reached for the porcelain teacup still resting beside Victoria's plate and carefully placed it back onto its matching saucer. The soft click echoed through the room. "Respect," he finally said, "is not measured by the chair you occupy. It is measured by how you treat the person who serves your meal. Victoria forced a smile that looked increasingly uncertain. Vincent, surely we are making far too much of a simple misunderstanding. He turned toward her with calm patience. If it were a misunderstanding, every witness would have remembered the same story. She opened her mouth to answer but found no words. The guests remained perfectly still. Even those who had quietly laughed earlier now seemed uncomfortable sitting behind polished crystal glasses and expensive silverware. Vincent shifted his attention toward Naomi. She still stood with remarkable composure despite the damp sleeve clinging to her arm. "Why did you accept blame?" he asked. Naomi hesitated, before answering honestly, "Because peace inside this home is more valuable than proving that I was right. I did not want anyone arguing because of me." Her words settled over the room with quiet sincerity. There was no bitterness, no attempt to gain sympathy, only a woman protecting the harmony of people who possessed far more power than she ever would. Vincent studied her for another long moment before turning toward Margaret Ellis. "Please call Dr. Harris and ask him to examine Miss Carter's wrist." Naomi immediately shook her head. "Sir, that is not necessary. I will be fine," Vincent answered gently. Making certain that an employee is well is always necessary. His voice never rose above a normal conversation, yet no one questioned the decision. Margaret nodded and quietly stepped from the room. Victoria folded her arms, trying to recover her confidence. "You are arranging a private physician over spilled tea?" Vincent looked at her without anger. "I am arranging proper care for someone who continued doing her job, even after being treated without kindness." He paused briefly before adding, "That difference matters." Emily smiled quietly from her chair, relieved that someone had finally noticed what she had seen from the beginning. Across the table, several relatives exchanged uneasy glances as memories of their own silence replayed inside their minds. They realized they had witnessed unfairness and chosen comfort instead of courage. Vincent noticed those expressions as well. "Every family protects its reputation," he said calmly. "The strongest families protect their values first. Reputation follows." No one challenged him. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the estate in warm light, while inside, something far more meaningful had begun to change. For the first time since Naomi arrived at the Romano mansion months earlier, she no longer felt invisible. She did not know what would happen next, but she sensed that the quiet dignity she had guarded through every difficult moment had finally been seen by the one person whose judgment could transform the future of everyone seated around that table. Dr. Harris arrived within 15 minutes carrying a small, black medical case that looked almost ordinary against the luxury surrounding it. He greeted Vincent with a respectful nod before turning his attention to Naomi. "May I see your wrist?" he asked kindly. Naomi glanced toward Vincent, then slowly lowered the folded napkin. The redness had become more noticeable, although she still tried to minimize it with an apologetic smile. "It really is not serious," she said softly. Dr. Harris examined her carefully before applying a soothing cooling gel and wrapping the area with a light bandage. "You were fortunate," he said. "The skin will recover well, but it should be treated properly." Naomi thanked him with quiet sincerity. She had expected criticism that afternoon, never compassion. Vincent waited until the physician finished before speaking again. "Margaret, please arrange 2 paid days of rest for Miss Carter after today's shift." Naomi immediately looked up in surprise. "Sir, I cannot accept paid leave. My mother depends on every paycheck." Vincent answered without hesitation. "Your paycheck will remain exactly the same. Rest is part of doing your job well, not a reward." His words left Naomi speechless. She had spent years believing that hard work alone earned respect, yet no employer had ever spoken to her that way. Across the table, Victoria's patience finally disappeared. "This is becoming ridiculous," she said sharply. "We are reorganizing an entire afternoon over a household employee." Once again, Vincent did not respond with anger. He simply faced her with the same calm expression that had unsettled the room from the moment he arrived. "No," he replied. "We are responding to a failure of character." The distinction hung in the air. "Every person in this house represents the Romano family," he continued. "Guests remember the decorations for one evening. They remember how they were treated for a lifetime. The same is true for those who work here." Several relatives quietly lowered their eyes. They understood he was speaking to all of them now. Vincent reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a slim leather notebook containing the schedules and responsibilities for the estate. He handed it to Margaret Ellis. "Effective immediately, all household employees will report directly to you regarding daily operations during family events. Any concern involving staff conduct will be reviewed by you before reaching anyone else." Margaret accepted the notebook with visible surprise. "Thank you, sir. I will do my best." Vincent nodded once. Then he looked back at Victoria. "Until further notice, you will not supervise household staff during family gatherings." The announcement landed like a stone dropped into still water. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only one quiet decision that instantly changed the balance of authority inside the mansion. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "You are embarrassing me in front of the family." Vincent's expression remained steady. "No. Choices create embarrassment. Accountability simply reveals it." The elegant room fell silent once more. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the gardens, while inside the Romano estate something far more enduring had taken root. The people who had watched without speaking finally understood that true authority did not need anger to command respect. Sometimes the strongest judgment arrived in the calmest voice, and on that afternoon every person seated at the table realized that dignity had quietly become the most valuable thing in the room. The gathering slowly resumed, but it no longer resembled the confident celebration that had filled the mansion only an hour earlier. Conversations became quieter, laughter more thoughtful, and even the clinking of crystal glasses seemed restrained by the lessons everyone had witnessed. Naomi excused herself with Margaret's permission and stepped into the estate's peaceful courtyard, where late afternoon sunlight filtered through rows of old maple trees and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming roses across the stone pathways. She sat carefully on a small wooden bench beside the garden fountain, looking down at the fresh bandage wrapped around her wrist. It was not the injury that brought moisture to her eyes. She had endured harder days than this. What overwhelmed her was something she had almost forgotten existed. Someone had believed her worth protecting without asking what she could offer in return. For years she had measured success by surviving one paycheck after another, one difficult shift after the next. Respect had always felt like a luxury reserved for other people. She quietly wiped away a tear before anyone could see it. "May I join you?" Vincent's voice carried no command, only courtesy. Naomi immediately stood. "Of course, sir." He gently shook his head. "Please sit. You have been standing for everyone else all day." She hesitated before returning to the bench while Vincent remained standing nearby, his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his charcoal jacket as he looked across the carefully maintained gardens. "Margaret told me you have been here almost 9 months, he said. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir. She also told me you have never been late, never complained, and often volunteer to cover extra shifts when someone is sick." Naomi smiled faintly. "People have helped me throughout my life. Covering someone else's shift never felt like a sacrifice." Vincent turned toward her. "Why did you never mention your mother's health?" Naomi lowered her eyes. "Because everyone carries burdens, sir. Mine are simply my responsibility." For a moment neither of them spoke. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm while birds drifted across the bright afternoon sky above the gardens. Vincent finally broke the silence. "When my grandmother raised my brothers and me, she cleaned offices at night after working all day in a bakery. She used to tell us that the strongest people were usually the quietest because they spent their energy building lives instead of seeking attention." Naomi listened carefully, surprised that a man whose name inspired so much respect would choose to share something so personal. "She would have liked meeting you," he added with a small smile. Naomi felt another wave of emotion rise unexpectedly. "That is one of the kindest things anyone has ever said to me." Vincent reached into his jacket and handed her a simple white envelope. "This is not charity," he said before she could refuse it. "It is reimbursement for the uniform that was damaged today and an advance toward replacing it. No employee of this family should ever have to pay personally for something that happened while serving this household." Naomi accepted the envelope with trembling hands. She knew the money inside would help cover her mother's next medical appointment. But more valuable than the financial relief was the respect with which it had been offered. As the afternoon sun settled lower beyond the trees, the grand Romano estate appeared unchanged from the outside. Yet inside its walls something meaningful had quietly shifted. Naomi no longer felt like a shadow passing unnoticed through beautiful rooms. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt seen not for the work she performed, but for the character she had carried with her every single day. 1 month later, the Romano estate welcomed another family gathering beneath the same crystal chandeliers, across the same polished marble floors, and around the same magnificent dining table where silence had once hidden an uncomfortable truth. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely different. The household staff moved through the room with quiet confidence instead of cautious hesitation, greeting guests with genuine smiles rather than anxious expressions. Margaret Ellis now coordinated every detail of the event with calm authority, and every member of the family treated the employees with a level of courtesy that had become the new standard rather than an exception. Naomi Carter walked into the dining room wearing a freshly tailored uniform that matched the elegance of the estate without diminishing her own quiet dignity. The small bandage had long since disappeared from her wrist, leaving only a faint reminder of a day that had changed far more than a single afternoon. As she prepared the place settings, several guests thanked her by name. Others smiled warmly when she served them coffee or refilled their glasses. Respect had replaced indifference so naturally that it almost felt as though it had always belonged there. Almost. Emily ran into the room carrying a drawing she had made with colored pencils. She stopped beside Naomi and proudly held up the picture. Showed a large house beneath a bright blue sky, a smiling woman in a black uniform, and another figure standing nearby in a charcoal suit. Across the top, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Kind people make beautiful homes." Naomi knelt to Emily's height and thanked her with tears of gratitude shining gently in her eyes. Across the room, Vincent noticed the exchange and allowed himself the smallest smile before returning to a conversation with several business associates. He had not spoken publicly about what had happened a month earlier, nor had he needed to. Leadership was rarely defined by speeches. It was revealed through the standards people chose to protect every day afterward. Victoria attended the gathering as well, but the confidence she once wore so effortlessly had been replaced by quiet reflection. She no longer directed employees or interrupted their work. When Naomi approached her table with fresh tea, Victoria stood before anyone expected her to. The room grew noticeably still. She looked directly into Naomi's eyes and said, "Miss Carter, I owe you an apology that should have been given long ago. I treated you without the respect every person deserves. I am sincerely sorry." Naomi accepted the words with the same grace that had carried her through every difficult moment. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I hope today is a better beginning for all of us." There was no triumph in her voice, only peace. The conversation ended with a simple handshake that surprised everyone who witnessed it. Sometimes forgiveness required more courage than confrontation. Later that evening, as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the gardens and the final guests prepared to leave, Vincent paused near the front entrance and looked back at the people filling the mansion with conversation and laughter. The building had not changed. The marble was still polished, the chandeliers still glittered, and the wealth surrounding them remained exactly the same. What had changed was something far more valuable. The people inside had learned that power could command obedience, money could purchase luxury, and status could attract admiration, but only respect could earn lasting loyalty. And on that quiet afternoon, everyone inside the Romano estate remembered what true dignity looked like.